Morality and religion. For many people, there's an inextricable link between religion and morality. That is to say, that there's a necessary connection between having morality and having religion. That without religion, you can't be moral, or that morality itself is impossible without religion, or more specifically, without God. So for some, the idea of having a class even in ethics is really something that misses the point of morality in general. An ethics class is meaningless unless underlying that ethics class or underlying that ethical system is a divine being. And so the question is, does morality depend on religion? Now, this is not a position or an unpopular position. In fact, many people would argue that at the end of the day, we can come up with codes of ethics. We can talk about how we ought to behave in particular circumstances. But really, underlying all that is this religious sentiment or this notion of a divine being that's actually giving us the rules we ought to be following. So in some ways, this is a meta-ethical position. It's a position that would go something like this. It would say, well, how do I know murder is wrong? What does murder is wrong mean? Well, murder is wrong means something like God commands in one form or another, in one way or another, that murder is wrong. So in some ways, divine command theory really is a meta-ethical position. Now, I want to look at two religiously dependent positions. So one I've already mentioned is divine command theory. The other is natural law theory. And both of these have at various times been popular and in fact continue to be popular among many people. So we want to look at the issue whether or not we can in fact base our morality on religion. Or at least I might want to be a little more specific. Can we base a secular morality on religion? Because ultimately at the end of the day, as I mentioned in the introduction to the course, the only motivation, moral motivation that I expect you to have is the idea that you can justify, or you should desire to justify your actions to others on grounds they could not reasonably reject. So the question is, does religion give us that sort of grounding? Can we in fact base morality or appeal at the end of the day to some sort of religious doctrine? So let's start with divine command theory. Divine command theory says very simply that what is moral is that which God commands. So whatever my moral statement is, murder is wrong, stealing is wrong, what have you, all of those statements reduce down to God commands, or God says murder is wrong, stealing is wrong, and so forth. So morality is a series of commands, but a very special command. It's not just commands that you or I give. It's not somebody in authority, some individual person. It's what God commands. Now, divine command theory, which has been very popular, and as I mentioned already, it continues to be popular, has two main problems. And I want to talk about both of these. The first problem that divine command theory has is the problem of diversity. Now, this is what I would call an external problem. It's not a problem conceptually or within the theory, within divine command theory. It's a sort of practical problem. So first, we can obviously, if I say to you, well, let's base our morality on religion, one of the things one might point out is, well, aren't there a number of different religions? Which religion are you talking about? Now, for those of us in the United States, we might like to think, well, we're a Christian nation. But in fact, there are a lot of non-Christians. There are Jews. There are Muslims. There are Hindus. There are Buddhists. So if we're going to talk about religiously based morality, and we're going to say we should base morality on religion, well, which religion? Which then brings us into the debate, well, how do I judge between religions? What standard am I going to apply to say, well, this is the religion we ought to go with? The other problem is sex within the same religion. So let's assume for a minute that we are actually all Christian. Now, that's a really big assumption, given that we are in such a diverse society. But let's assume for the sake of argument that everyone was a Christian. Would that end the debate as far as religion and morality go? Well, clearly not, because even now, there are differences between Christian sects. Right? So we have Episcopalians and Methodists and Baptists and United Church, and we have the Roman Catholics and the Greek Orthodox and so forth and so on, and go right down the line. And then if I asked you, well, do they all agree on the same things? You say, well, no, they don't. I mean, there's radical differences between Catholicism and Protestantism, and then within Protestantism, there's an extreme amount of debate, especially on moral issues. So even if they all agree on some fundamentals, so for instance, that there was a Messiah, that Messiah was killed for our sins, rose again, and so forth and so on, those things may be accepted. But then the question of, well, does the church condone something like gay marriage? Or does our church allow for abortion? Or is the Eucharist the actual body and blood of Christ, or just a symbol? And so you get down into these different you get down to these both moral issues and doctrinal issues, which keep people apart. Now, another problem, of course, is interpretation. And some of those differences are, in fact, due to interpretation. So which Bible are we going to accept? Which books of the Bible? There are differences between the Catholic Bible and the Protestant Bible. And then how do we interpret those? Are these things, were some of these written for particular people at a particular time? Should we take the Bible literally? Is it literal fact? Is it historical? Is it metaphorical? Are there multiple levels to the Bible? So we might ask all of those, even if we agreed upon the religion, our interpretation. And that's true of any religion. There are different sects of Judaism. There are different sects of Buddhism. All of these admit of different interpretations. And finally, of course, we have atheists and agnostics. So even if I do base my morality on religion, the atheist or the agnostic might rightly say, well, why should I follow that dictate if I don't have your belief, if I don't share your belief? So if I have no belief in God, if I'm an atheist, then basing morality on religion is going to be problematic for the atheist, because they are not going to, and it will not be unreasonable for them to say, well, okay, prove to me that God exists, and then we'll go from there. Well, that right there is an extremely tall order. So there's a number of problems that stem just from diversity for divine command theory. So when I say what's moral is what God commands, a number of these issues come up. Now, there's a second problem, and I think this problem is what we call an internal problem, and it's a problem with the implications of the theory itself. So it's the implications of what follows from the idea that what's moral is what God commands. So let's begin with the assumption that the statement, moral is that which God commands, is true. Now, for those of you who might not share this view or question this, let's just, for the sake of argument, let's assume that that statement is true, that what's moral is that which God commands. What questions does this raise about the nature of morality? So what we're going to do is ask actually two questions. I think these are the implications, and the implications of this go back to Plato in 400 BC. Or actually, I should say Socrates. Plato writes about Socrates, but it's Socrates who actually brings up this question. And the questions go like this. If you accept that what's moral is what God commands, then I can pose the following two questions to you. Is something moral because God commands it? It's the first question. Or, second question, does God command something because it is moral? Now think carefully about these two statements, because they are different. There are times, if you read them quickly, they seem to be asking the same thing. But in fact, they aren't. The two questions are extremely different. Is something moral because God commands it? In other words, does something become right or wrong in virtue of, or simply because God says so? God says murder is wrong, therefore murder becomes wrong. Or does God give a particular command because that's the good thing to do? That's the moral thing. Now, there's different implications depending on which way you think this question is answered. So let's start with the first one. Is something moral because God commands it? What's the implication of saying, yes, that's what it is? I know that if something is commanded by God, then it's moral. It's moral in virtue of God's commands. Well, the implication of the first question then is the following. Let's assume that God gives some command. Murder is wrong. Could God have commanded otherwise? Well, I think on most Judeo-Christian sort of conceptions of God, all-knowing, all-powerful, and so forth, that of course we say God could have commanded other than God did. So if God wanted to say, for example, that adultery is okay, could God have given that command? Was there anything stopping God from giving that command? Well, we probably want to say if you believe God is all-powerful and all-knowing, then of course, nothing is stopping God from giving that command. But if that's the case, then isn't it also the case that God's commands are arbitrary? Now, I want to think about what this means. If God has a choice between two commands, murder is right, murder is wrong, and God chooses, if I say, well, why did you choose that? Then that's asking for a reason, that there was some sort of standard or something that God was appealing to. But notice that the first question says, no. What's moral is what God commands. And that seems to imply that God's commands are arbitrary. If God could have commanded otherwise, then you would say, well, God could have done the other way, didn't feel like commanding the other way, just happened to command this way. Now, if that seems wrong, there seems something fundamentally flawed about that. You might say, wait, God just doesn't command arbitrarily. God wouldn't pick one way of doing things over another on a whim. God must have some reason. God picks only those things that are good for us to do, or picks those commands that keeps us from doing things that are bad, which leads then to the second question. Right, so the implication of the second question said, well, does God command something because it is moral? And you might say, yeah, that sounds more like what I think about God. God is all-knowing, all-loving, all-caring, and God would only command things that are good. God would never say, for instance, that murder is okay. God would never say stealing is okay. Those things are bad, so God only commands things that are good. But then we run into some additional problems. So let's say God only commands good things. God's commands are thus constrained by morality, right? So God can't just command anything, or God wouldn't command anything, because those things are bad. God's all good and all-knowing, so God must only command those things that are good. But that would mean that God's commands are constrained in a way. They're constrained by morality. But this also implies that there would have to be a source of morality independent of God. Therefore, God is not the source of morality, and the question would be, why do I even need God? Now, if that seems a little quick for you, let me step back a minute and explain. In the first instance, we said what's moral is simply God commanding. Whatever it happens to be, God commands. And then the objection might be, well, no, God only commands good things. Well, if God commands good things, then there would have to be a standard separate from God. Well, why does there have to be a standard separate from God? Because otherwise, if there isn't a morality out there somewhere, then we're back to the first sort of answer. It's what's moral is what God commands. You say, oh no, God isn't bound by any morality. God isn't bound by something else. There is an independent morality, or morality independent of God. God is the source of morality. So now we're back to the first one. Well, if God is the source of morality, then why did he command it? He commanded it because he felt like commanding it. You say, oh no, but God will only command good things. Well, then God must be constrained in some way. God must be able to look out in the universe, out in the world, whatever, out in creation, and say, here are good things, here are bad things, and I'm only going to command the good ones. But that implies that there's something separate from God, that it's not just in virtue of God saying it, but that God is recognizing something as moral or immoral. And if you don't acknowledge that, we continually fall back sort of in the circle. We fall back into, well, it's just what God chose. So you say, well, yes, but God created the good and the bad. Or God created the good and the bad is sort of there. You say, well, then God could have created otherwise, right? And so we're back to our original problem. So if you buy into divine command theory, and if you say that's what's moral is what God commands, then we need an answer to one of these two questions. Is it moral in virtue of the command, just simply because God commands it, or does God command something because it's moral? The implications of the first question are, well, then God's commands are arbitrary, and why should I follow the dictates of an arbitrary God? I want reason. We talked about the minimal conception of morality. A minimal conception of morality is good reasons. So if God can give me good reasons, that would be one thing, but that's not what we're saying. We're not saying God has to justify God's moral theory. We're saying, no, these are the commands we follow. And if we say, oh, no, God, of course, has reasons. There's good and bad. God only commands what's good. Then it seems like we fall into, well, what do we need God for? There's already a moral standard in the universe that's independent of God. God is not the source of morality. So this becomes problematic for the religious believer and for those who want to base morality on religion. Now, does this mean now that after you hear this, you say, well, my gosh, let's imagine you're a good church-going individual and you say, well, I guess I'm going to have to give up my religion because either my God is arbitrary or my God is not the source of morality. But I don't think that's the inevitable result of this. I think what is the result or the implication of this is that we should be aware of the fact that our religious beliefs are based upon faith and not reason. That at the end of the day, you may look at the argument I just presented. You may agree that divine command theory, yes, moral is what God commands. You recognize that these two questions are possible, that I can ask these two questions. You recognize that the implication of these two questions are less than ideal for the religious believer. And at the end of the day, you might say, yeah, but I still believe. I still follow those rules. And that's fine, because this is a question of faith and moral motivation. If it's based on faith, you say, look, at the end of the day, I just accept this on faith. Now, that's perfectly fine when we're talking about faith. But it's going to be problematic if we want a morality that is justified to all people. So I'm not just attempting to justify my actions to someone who agrees with my religious position. There are Christian ethics. There are Buddhist ethics for people who buy or believe the sort of core assumption. So if you're a Christian and you believe in the core assumption about an all-good God and the commands and so forth and so on, then you can actually say, well, what were the implications? Assuming this is true, what are the implications? But if we're trying to come up with a morality that doesn't assume, or moral positions or moral actions, justify moral actions that don't assume we share this fundamental religious starting point, then we're going to want to look to something else. So this is problematic when we're looking for a secular morality, one that's going to apply to Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, atheists, agnostics, whatever your belief or lack thereof happens to be. So this is why divine command theory runs into problems, because once we try to move it, one, it seems to be ultimately based on faith, and two, it poses a problem for those who don't share that particular faith. Now, aside from the divine command theory, there is a second religiously dependent position, and it's slightly different from divine command theory, and this is what's referred to as natural law theory. Now, there is some similarity between the two theories. In divine command theory, we say that what's moral is what God commands. Natural law theory has a similar sort of view, except God's commands are not explicit commands in the way we might get from biblical text or something along those lines. We get our morality in natural law theory from creation itself. In other words, the morality is built into creation. It's not separate from. There's not our empirical world, our world of nature and so forth, and then there's morality sort of imposed from above, but morality is actually built into the creation. And so we can actually know what's moral or immoral by looking at God's creation. So again, it's still dependent on a divine being, but it's slightly different, slightly more complex than looking for or analyzing just commands. So the three main components of natural law theory, and again, this comes right from your textbook. One is that the world has a rational order with values and purposes built into it. So the world is designed with morality, where we can look to nature, we can look to creation, and we can find a sort of moral order within that creation. Laws of nature not only describe the way things are, but the way things ought to be. So it's not just that animals behave in certain ways, or plants grow in certain seasons, or certain things occur in a certain way arbitrarily. But the laws that govern nature, the laws about the way things work in nature, is not only how things are, but it's the way they ought to be. And then at the end of the day, right and wrong are derived from reason. So we can look at this creation, we can sort of tease out the implications of nature. What we observe in nature then in some way corresponds to right and wrong in a moral sense. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on natural law theory. I think in many ways it's a theory that is easy to sort of refute. And there are several objections we can raise to this. So there's several problems with natural law theory, and just let me go quickly over some of these problems. So the problems with natural law theory. Well, there's several problems that we can point out about natural law theory. The first of these is that the theory is at odds with our current scientific theories of the nature of the universe. So when we look at the universe and we look at our empirical data that we get of the universe, we don't seem to find morality within that information. So I don't look in a microscope or I don't look in a telescope and see moral or immoral. In fact, nature doesn't seem to tell me what's moral or immoral. So to go back to an example I gave in the past, imagine I walk into class, I pull out a knife, and I stab a student. And imagine that you're asked by the police later on, which inevitably would be called, and say, well, what did you observe? You might say, well, professor came in, pulled out a knife, took the knife, stabbed a student in the heart, and the student fell down dead. Now notice in that description, nowhere did you say, and it was wrong. Or there was an aura that came up, wrong. Right? We didn't see that. What you saw was an action. Arm goes back, thrust forward with the knife, knife goes in chest, person falls down, dead, there it is. Where's the morality? Where did you see the moral or the immoral? Well, you didn't see the moral or the immoral. What you saw were a series of physical acts. So it would seem that the natural law theorist is going to have a problem if we're comparing what science tells us we can observe and what the natural law theorist tells us we can observe. The other problem, this is brought up by David Hume, is you can't get an ought from an is. So the fact that something is a particular way in no way implies that it ought to be that way. So the fact that certain species kill each other, certain animals, right? We have certain, we can say that hawks come down and kill smaller birds. So one species of bird kills another species of bird. Doesn't tell me that it ought to be the case that one species can kill another species. Or we wouldn't want to say that just because in nature people or animals compete for territory, they kill each other. So if we look at something like apes that regularly will go to war with neighboring tribes of apes, that doesn't imply that war is a good thing. We might want to say, well, that is the case. That is in fact what we see in nature. But ought it to be the case? We can still ask that moral question. And finally, one of the problems with natural law theory is that believers are not in any privileged moral position relative to non-believers. Now, for non-believers, or those of us who are looking for a secular morality, this might not be a bad thing. In fact, this might be a good thing. But it also seems to imply that I don't need any particular religious faith at all. That if morality is built into nature, then any sort of religious observance, while it may be nice and may be good for other things, has no bearing on morality. That I can, by observing the physical world, tease out what's moral or immoral. And therefore, I can do away with the vast majority of the dictates of religion. So if, again, we're looking at something like Christianity, I don't have to declare Christ as a savior or go to church or be baptized or any of those things in order to be a moral person. In fact, it's unnecessary. It's completely unnecessary because, again, with natural law theory, morality is built into the very fabric of the universe. And so I should simply be able to observe that. So is that a bad thing? Well, again, it depends on what your sort of meta-ethical position is. If you want to say that morality is based on religion and you are a divine command theorist, well, one, you seem to want to keep God in the mix, right? That's a direct sort of way in which you want to do that. If you're a natural law theorist, you also seem to want to keep God in the mix, but it seems that God here is in some way unnecessary, that God has put the universe in motion, has built morality into the universe, and I don't actually need to appeal to God in any religious sense in order to get my morality.